Well, guys, this is our fourth class in Bunsen burners, beakers, and Bibles, the intersection of science and faith. Welcome back. Glad you are all with us tonight. And just, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. So let's go to this slide and this one. So just to recap where we are, we have now finished the three topics in yellow, God's two books, Short History of Science, and What is Modern Science. Tonight, we're going to cover this fourth topic, History's Puzzle. And it fits into an hour pretty nicely. Previously, at the beginning of this class, I introduced the idea that I wanted to get across two key ideas in the class. The first was that God has written two books for us, His Word and His Works, and that was the topic of the first class. The second idea I wanted to get to was that Christian thought played a key role in the birth of modern science, in the birth of science as we know it today. And I'm using all three of these topics to get me to that third key idea. So we're going to actually get to the punchline tonight. It's been 3 weeks in the coming, but that's where we're headed tonight. We're going to wrap up and get to this key idea, how Christian thought played a role in science as we know it today. So that's where we are. And at this point, I'm going to switch to our slides for tonight, which is right here. There we go. Should be up. I call it History's Puzzle. And in the previous two topics, I've endeavored, and let me get my pointer on once again. In the previous weeks, I hope I've convinced you that modern science did emerge in 17th century Europe, that modern science was really something unique and different from knowledge of nature that occurred in previous centuries. But we still haven't answered the two questions, why then, why there? And that's what I'm calling History's Puzzle. Here are some of the voices who have puzzled. And the first is J. Robert Oppenheimer. You probably recognize this name. He was a physicist and the director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, part of the Manhattan Project in World War II. In a word, he was the chief scientist of the Manhattan Project, created the atomic bomb. In 1961, he was in Boulder, Colorado, and he gave an invited lecture on campus with the title On Science and Culture. And I've got a text of that lecture as well as an audio recording. And in the course of the lecture, he expresses puzzlement. In fact, he says at one point, it's not a simple question to answer why the scientific revolution occurred when it did. When Oppenheimer says scientific revolution, he's starting about the events that unfolded with science in Europe in the 17th century. So it sounds to me like he's puzzled. And here's a couple other quotes. In fact, he even uses the word puzzle. He said, "It is particularly puzzling that the scientific revolution did not occur in the Greco-Roman civilization." And I think we can see why he said that, given even the short history I gave to us about the golden age of ancient Greece. Another quote from Oppenheimer: "I think the best guess is that modern science required something that was not present in Chinese civilization that was wholly absent in Indian civilization and absent also from Greco-Roman civilization. I like this quote because he kind of hits at something missing, a key ingredient that just was absent in earlier periods of history. So he's going to go looking for that. And somewhat surprisingly, he does give Christianity credit for providing that something. But in the course of reading his lecture, I find his explanation to be pretty weak because it centers around doing good works or the notion of bettering man's condition, the responsibility to society, a duty, if you will. And it just seems pretty thin. He doesn't exhibit much knowledge of Christian theology. His answer here is also kind of demeaning to earlier civilizations, as if they weren't also willing to do good works, to take responsibility, to take on duties for the betterment of their own societies. So Oppenheimer puzzled over the birth of modern science. He sort of credits Christianity, but it's not very convincing. Let's go on and listen to another voice. This voice is Bertrand Russell, probably also a name that you know. He was an English mathematician and philosopher, and he was rightfully renowned for his expertise in logic. Throughout his life, he was also a social and political activist. One of the works that he's most famous for is his lecture, Why I Am Not a Christian. This lecture made him one of 20th century's best-known atheists. Now, Russell came into Cambridge University as a mathematics student, and he was tutored by a professor named A.N. Whitehead at Cambridge. And the two of them, student and tutor, later collaborated on a volume called Principia Mathematica, considered one of 20th century's most important works in mathematical logic. Without question, he was a brilliant mathematician. And I mentioned Whitehead because we're going to hear from Whitehead in just a couple of minutes. So what did Russell have to say about this puzzle that we're discussing tonight? Well, here's a couple quotes. Well, actually, this is what another author has written about Russell. Bertrand Russell, for example, thought of the Christian church as repressing and inhibiting the growth of science. Russell was therefore disappointed to note that science did not emerge in China, even though, as Russell said, the spread of scientific knowledge there encountered no such obstacles as he thought the church put in its way in Europe. Well, you can see from this quote, he's taking a very different direction than Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer argues very weakly, but concludes that Christianity was the difference. Russell says nothing of the sort. Russell views the Christian faith as being an obstacle to science. Here's another quote directly from Russell's Science, which has forced its way step by step against the Christian religion, against the churches, and against the opposition of all the old precepts. So Russell's pretty clear. He thinks Christianity not only had nothing to contribute, it was an out-and-out obstacle to faith. And another thing I'll notice as I've read a little about Bertrand Russell, he discusses the scientific revolution in Europe in the 17th century, but he really doesn't give an answer to why then and why there. He just remarks that the church was obviously an impediment to science happening at that time and at that place. But he really doesn't answer the question, well, then why did it? Well, I said I would introduce you to Dr. Whitehead, and here he is. He's going to be our third voice, our third puzzler about the history of science. Alfred North Whitehead, he, as I just explained, a colleague of Bertrand Russell. Whitehead was originally a professor of mathematics at Cambridge, but by the by the 1920s, he'd kind of changed direction. He decided he wanted to work in philosophy and leave mathematics behind. Maybe he felt he had contributed everything he could to mathematics. So he wanted to be a philosopher. Well, he didn't find any offers in a philosophy department in the UK. I'm sure they weren't happy about a mathematician coming in and claiming to be a philosopher. However, across the ocean in Connecticut, Yale University was more than happy to receive a scholar of his stature, and they gave him a professorship in philosophy at Yale in 1924. In fact, Whitehead's arrival in the United States was such a big deal that he was invited to deliver a distinguished series of lectures the very next year, 1925. It's called the Lowell Lectures. It's an annual lecture series hosted in Boston. And for this event, Whitehead lectured every evening for 8 consecutive nights, and his lectures were subsequently published in a book that I now have. Well, you may ask the question, well, I'll talk about why I went looking for Whitehead in just a minute. But first, let's look at what Whitehead had to say about the history's puzzle. And Whitehead could not have had a different answer than Russell. Here's one quote. In the first place, there can be no living science unless there is a widespread instinctive conviction in the existence of an order of nature. Now, in the text that follows in his lecture, order of nature, by that, Whitehead was talking about cause and effect, laws of nature, that kind of thing. And Whitehead makes the point that without these beliefs, scientists would lack the optimism or the hope needed to do the hard work of science. That becomes part of his argument that those early scientists, 17th century Europe, they had this deep instinctive conviction in an order of nature, laws of nature. That's interesting. It's a very different kind of conclusion compared to Bertrand Russell. Here's some more quotes. Whitehead said, faith in the possibility of science is an unconscious derivative from medieval theology. Okay, so not only did science need confidence in laws of nature, but Whitehead concludes that that confidence came from medieval Christian theology of all places. And he goes on to say elsewhere, when we compare this tone of thought in Europe with the attitude of other civilizations, there seems but one source of its origin. It must come from the medieval insistence on the rationality of God. Now, so again, Whitehead's going a step further. Not only is it Christian theology, but that theology is centered around a real conviction about God God's rule of his creation being rational. Very important idea. One author in our modern day notes that Whitehead's audience was shocked by this kind of conclusion. You see, the thinking in Whitehead's time was much more consistent with Bertrand Russell than with the conclusions that Whitehead introduced in this lecture series. Couldn't have been different. Whitehead is saying Christianity emerged because of Christianity. Russell said Whitehead said science emerged because of Christianity. Russell said science emerged in spite of opposition from Christianity. Completely different answer to the history's puzzle. So now you may be wondering, what in the world am I doing reading a series of lectures from 1925? Well, here's the reason. Here's a reference to Whitehead, but these other authors, Stark in 2005, Plantinga, 2011, Francis Schaeffer, 1976, Maskell in 1956. I got to reading about what all of these scholars had to say about the arrival of modern science, and they all quoted Whitehead, every one of them. So eventually I decided I'd better get the book and read what Whitehead had to say. So this conclusion of Whitehead is echoed in the writings of Rodney Stark, Alvin Plantinga, Francis Schaeffer, and Maskell. And I want to try and summarize in the next few minutes, not in great detail, but I want to summarize what I think they observed, what Whitehead observed, and the other authors answer in very similar. I mean, they all describe this in their own language, but I think they're all speaking of one voice about these three convictions that I believe nurtured modern science. Okay, first one is that the physical realm is regular, predictable, and law-abiding. And I think one of those quotes from, well, the first quotes I gave you from Whitehead, I think were pretty clear about that. The second thing that comes out of the writings of all of these scholars is number two, the laws of nature are accessible to and knowable by humans. And the third principle that comes out as I read these authors is, number three, science must rely on observation, measurements, and experiments, what's known as empirical methods. In my view, these authors in unison argue for these three ideas, and that these three ideas were missing ingredients previously in human history. I want to discuss them one at a time and think about how they're each rooted in Christian doctrine, Christian belief. So taking them one at a time, the physical realm is regular, predictable, and law-abiding. This one, I hope, is pretty straightforward. Of course, one of the most foundational ideas in Jewish and Christian thought is the existence of God. In Deuteronomy 6, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. These are the opening words of the Shema, the daily prayer of the Jewish faith. It's just one of the core doctrines of Jewish and Christian faith. And along with that, we believe this God who exists is the creator, obviously, from stated clearly in the first verse of Genesis 1. And then the other thing that comes out of Christian belief that it's important, he's a law-giving creator. And we all readily think of God delivering the Ten Commandments to Moses. But in creation, he also delivered laws of nature. And in medieval theology, there was a great deal of effort spent developing the ideas of God's rational governance or providence over his creation. So that's one of the roots of this whole idea of the physical realm being regular, predictable, and law-abiding. And this idea was clearly present in the minds of some of the pioneers of modern science. So here's just two quick examples. This is a quick survey, but I think these two quotes are pretty representative. Robert Boyle, one of the contributors to chemistry in early science, he said, "God is the author of the universe and the free establisher of the laws of motion." So you can see he's clearly thinking about this in theological terms, God-given laws of nature. Roger Coates in the next century wrote, "From God's providence it is that those laws which we call the laws of nature have flowed." Coates was a mathematician and he collaborated with Isaac Newton. So again, he's thinking about the laws of nature in a theological sense, God being the author. All right, so that's this first Christian conviction that I think is foundational to modern science. The physical realm is regular, predictable, and law-abiding. Let's go on to the second one. See how I'm doing time-wise here. The second conviction I worded this way: the laws of nature are accessible to and knowable by Christians. Well, where does that come from in Christian belief? I think the core verse would be Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. The idea that humans were created in the image of God has long been part of Christian doctrine. Often the Latin words imago Dei, image of God, is used in relation to this doctrine. To this idea, the medieval theologians added a phrase in Latin, adequatio intellectus ad rem, which I think best translates into English as something like the correspondence of intellect to thing, or the correspondence of intellect to reality. So medieval theologians developed the idea that there's a match between our human sensory and mental faculties and reality. And that's, I think, we can understand as a pretty core conviction that would encourage the study of nature in a very systematic way. Another way to phrase this is that we humans resemble God by being able to understand much about our world, about ourselves, and about God himself. So that brought Christian thought in Europe. It raised up to a broad consensus, this idea that the laws not only were there laws of nature, but those laws are accessible to and knowable by humans. And as Whitehead previously observed, doing science is hard work. You've got to have some optimism you're going to get a result. And this core conviction really provides a basis for that optimism. Well, was this on the minds of the pioneer scientists? Here's a couple examples. I'm actually going to start with not a pioneer scientist, but a Christian theologian, Aquinas, from the 13th century, 4 centuries earlier. He said, "Only in rational creatures is there found a likeness of God that counts as an image." imitating God, not only in this, that he is and lives, but especially in this, that he understands. So foundational thought from Aquinas 400 years earlier. And Kepler, just before the dawn of the 17th century, he wrote, "These laws of nature are within the grasp of the human mind." You can see the same conviction that Aquinas expressed centuries earlier. Kepler said God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts. This is pretty interesting by Kepler. He's almost saying, not only has God given us the ability to do science, he wants us to do science. He wants us to know the laws of nature. Pretty interesting. So Kepler may have been an early scientist, but again, he's thinking about it in theological terms. So that's our second principle. Laws of nature are accessible to and knowable by humans. The third one is that science must rely on observation, measurements, and experiments. And this is easily the most obtuse of the three convictions that we're going to discuss. So hang with me. So from Christian belief, we've already talked about God being rational. That was a theme in medieval theology. But when it came to the act of creating, was God constrained in any way? Maybe an obtuse question, but theologians and philosophers in the Middle Ages, the centuries before modern science, were asking questions like this. What do they mean by this? Was God constrained? Well, were there boundaries? Were there any boundaries to God's creation from some deeper magic, some deeper logic? Or another way to think about it, did creation have to be just so? And as the medieval scholars and theologians talked about it, they concluded no, there was no deeper magic, no deeper logic. Creation didn't have to be just so. Rather, God was free to make design choices as he saw fit. God was not obliged to create in any specific way. As a consequence of that conclusion, the early scientists then realized that they couldn't predict the laws of nature ahead of time, or a priori, as it sometimes is the term used. The pioneers of modern science realized they'd have to just go out and look and observe. And that's where this conviction on observation, measurement, experiment flows from. Here's an example of how one of the pioneers of early science expressed that. And again, this is the mathematician Roger Coates. In fact, his first quote's in the middle of this paragraph. Let's read the whole paragraph. Coates said, "Without all doubt, this world, so diversified with that variety of forms and motions we find in it, could arise from nothing but the perfectly free will of God, directing and presiding over it all." So this phrase, perfectly free will of God, no constraints, the creation wouldn't have to be just so. God was perfectly free. Here's the sentence we've read before. From this fountain it is that those laws, which we call the laws of nature, have flowed. And then he goes on and says, now in the laws of nature, in which there appear many traces indeed of the most wise contrivance, but not the least shadow of necessity. Now, contrivance means innovation or inventiveness. But when he uses this phrase, not the least shadow of necessity, That goes back to the idea rejected by the medieval theologians that there were boundaries or pre-existing rules or magic or logic that would constrain how God created. That's the word necessity gets used to describe that whole point of view. So because Coates believes in the perfectly free will, not in necessity, he concludes, therefore, we must not seek from uncertain conjectures, but must learn them, laws of nature, from observations and experiments. Coates is very consciously thinking about this, this whole problem of how God created. Was he constrained? Was he free? And therefore, I love the word, therefore, we have to go out and observe. We have to experiment. And that's this conviction. Science must rely on observation, measurements, and experiments, what we call empirical methods. Well, guys, those are the three convictions that the authors that I've explored have been writing about. And I think they agree in unison that modern science emerged when it did, where it did, because these three novel ideas, grounded in Christian thought and belief, emerged as widely held convictions in 17th century Europe. And there's the three listed again. In layman's terms, to the best of my ability, I think that's what Whitehead and Stark and Plantinga and all the others are saying. Pretty remarkable, their answer to the puzzle. I'm going to summarize this with a brand new quote. This is from a 20th century physicist, von Weizsäcker. He said, modern science is a legacy of Christianity. Now, the word legacy means gift or inheritance, perhaps. Modern science is a legacy of Christianity. This couldn't be a more different answer than Russell proposed that we read about earlier. Pretty remarkable. I hope you'll take this quote with you as kind of summarizing this whole question of history's puzzle. Okay, we have a few minutes left. Having presented what I did, I want to give some cautions. I want to clarify some things that I am not saying in giving you this presentation tonight. The first thing I'm not saying is this: Christianity alone was the source of modern science, or to use other words, Christianity was sufficient for modern science. It might sound like that, but that is not what I'm saying. I'm rejecting those ideas. But what I am saying is that Christianity was necessary for modern science. It provided key missing ingredients. Remember, Oppenheimer brought up that idea of something being missing in earlier periods of human history. Well, I think those three convictions I just summarized were missing ingredients. Okay, another thing I'm not saying. I'm not saying white Europeans are superior to all their other races and cultures. Someone could very easily take the ideas I've talked about tonight and draw this conclusion. But guys and gals, I'm not saying that. I am saying that Christian beliefs led to a broad consensus in Europe about a better method to obtain knowledge of the laws of nature. I just want to say clearly That's how I think about it. And I think that's the more correct way to think about it. Let's not get into racial or cultural superiority arguments. I don't think that's warranted, as well as being ugly. A third thing I'm not saying is that one must be a Christian to do science. Hopefully that doesn't seem too surprising. I'm not saying one must be a Christian to do science. But here's something I am saying. All scientists operate under the three core convictions presented here tonight that are rooted in Christian belief. Whether a scientist is a Christian or not, religious or not, atheist or not, whether that scientist is aware of these three ideas or completely oblivious, it doesn't matter. When they do science, they're operating in harmony with these three core ideas presented here. That's pretty interesting. They don't even have to know these ideas exist. They don't have to believe they're even true, but they're still operating consistent with these three convictions when they do science. So to sum up, here's the quote from Weizsäcker, which I think in one sentence says it all. And I agree with Weizsäcker that modern science is a legacy of Christianity because these three novel ideas, grounded in Christian belief and thought, emerged as widely held convictions in 17th century Europe. And there's the three. So that's my answer to history's puzzle. And it's been, it took me 3 hours to get to this punchline. I thought, I hope to make it convincing, the short history of science from the ancient Greeks and on forward. I hope the description of what is modern science, I hope that filled in some of the territory. But it all leads to an answer, I believe, to this puzzle. Why did modern science emerge in 17th century Europe? I concur with those authors and scholars I listed previously. I think it's because of Christianity, and that is a pretty remarkable conclusion. In fact, in the 50 years I've been a Christian, I haven't heard this taught. I haven't heard this preached. I haven't heard this celebrated. And because of that, that's one of the reasons I'm giving this class this fall, is because I think these are ideas worth knowing about.